When Lorianne and I first got to know each other, one of the things that we were initially made a connection on is we both love British humor. I know, not a huge shock for any of you. But I grew up loving all that stuff, whether it was Blackadder, Hello, Hello, The Python Boys, Red Dwarf, any of that sort of stuff. Loved it all. And I recently ran across a sketch from a British show which I was not familiar with. But something about it, I just chuckle every time I think of it. It's a couple of German army officers fighting on the Russian front. And they're out there and they're talking. And one of them says to his buddy, Hans, I was looking at our uniforms. Have you ever noticed all these skulls? Are we the bad guys? And you see him go through this whole thing. It's like, well, our enemies didn't put the skulls on our uniforms. And his buddy says, well, maybe they're the skulls of our enemies. And he says, that doesn't really help now, does it? But you see him just come to this slow realization that maybe we're the bad guys. And there's a reason, you see it presented in comedy there, but there's a reason that realization that a character is the bad guy pops up consistently in film and TV and literature. I came of age at the time the Braveheart, the movie, came out, and one of the most powerful scenes in that is when they're fighting for Scottish independence, and Robert the Bruce, who thinks he's the hero of the story, betrays William Wallace. And you see Wallace being hauled off by the English, and Robert the Bruce there lying in the field wondering, what have I done? That realization is so powerful. It continues to pop up everywhere in art. Now, the more astute among you have already figured out where I'm going to go with that. That question, are we the bad guys? Let's explore it this way. What you just heard read for us was the center of the Ten Commandments. These rules governing how do we interact with each other. Don't murder, don't steal, don't commit adultery, don't bear false witness. And a lot of times we think of this in the most narrow legal points. So I want to hone in this morning on the eighth commandment. Don't bear false witness. And you think of that, and you think, okay, well, that's obviously, I'm not supposed to lie in court about my neighbor. And when you think of it in those narrow terms, it's easy to do. It's easy to sit there and say, well, if I'm ever under oath, I'll tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. It's not multiple choice. I can do that. And we put it in that box so it's out of the way, and we don't have to deal with it. But that's not the point of it. Martin Luther, in his explanation for the eighth commandment, does this great job. And he says, look, what this really is about speaking kindly about your neighbor and the people you encounter. And he uses this particular phrase, which has stuck with me forever. Interpret their actions in the most charitable way. And it's this beautiful piece of writing that Luther has. So how does this play out? Let me tell you a story. Way back when the earth was young and dinosaurs roamed the land, this was a time for me when I was between college and seminary. And my home church, the church I was still attending at the time, had this huge, the church was big. The church had this huge confirmation program. I forget how many kids were in it, but it filled this gymnasium at the local junior high that we were meeting at. And I got guilted into being one of the adults for a group of seventh grade boys. You know how it is where somebody will get up in front of church and say, these young people are going to go to hell unless we get somebody up here to help them. And so I fell for it. And I was not mentally, emotionally, or spiritually prepared to deal with a group of 6 seventh grade boys. Have you ever dealt with a pack of seventh grade boys? I had not at the time. And it's like dealing with raccoons. Not the cute, fuzzy raccoons you see in Disney movies that sing as you float down the river, But those raccoons that we're all familiar with in the Midwest, always hungry and occasionally rabid, it's about what they were. And I remember dreading Wednesday nights. I hated going on Wednesday nights. I was not prepared to deal with them. And it was just every week, it's like, what do I do? These kids are just what am I going to do them? And the guy who was partnering with me in this group, he had daughters, and he's like, girls never act this way. This is crazy. Can we tranquilize them? It's like Wild Kingdom. And I remember being there one night, and the associate pastor who was leading confirmation was teaching that night. And he was teaching on the 8th commandment. And he was talking about this. And he said, really what this is, if you're looking down on people, if you're speaking ill of them, if you're being cranky, if you're taking everything that they do and you're interpreting in the worst possible way, and you're saying that these people are beneath you, you're breaking the 8th commandment. 20 some odd years later, I still remember sitting there thinking, yeah, that's me. I'm breaking the commandment in every single way. And it was one of those things that was just an ouch for me, because I was realizing I was the villain of the story. And if we're honest with ourselves, the 8th commandment, and the reason I'm poking at it today is because it is one that is so easy for us to break. So easy for us to get in that mode of being cranky, of being argumentative, of saying these people are awful. Or looking at that coworker or relative and saying what they're doing is awful, and it's because they're an awful person and they did it because they want to be bad. And it's so easy for us to do. But let's flip this around the other way. As we've been going through this series, I have been reminded so much of something I knew, but needed to be reminded of. That the 10 Commandments, it's a two-sided sword. On one hand, it's don't do these things. On the other hand, it's let's go with a better way to live. Let's live in this space where we're taking joy in each other, where we're living in what God has promised, where we're looking forward to having that new heart within us and being able to love each other. Think about it. Think about those times when you're cranky and angry and yelling at everybody. Does it help? I mean, how many times have you done that where you've either been around somebody who's cranky or you've just been cranky yourself and you've done that just verbally unload about all these different people or unloaded on somebody because you just feel like they're bad and they deserve it? Does it help? Does it help in the long run? You might get what you want in the short run for yelling at some poor clerk who's earning a minimum wage at the supermarket. But is that good for your soul? Is that something you want to be proud of? See, we're called to a new place, a new way of life. And let me give you this passage in this story. You see, David, King David, man after God's own heart, greatest king of all of Israel, does a series of horrible things, and we're going to talk about that next week. But when he's done, he writes this beautiful psalm, and he's got these words in there: create in me a new heart, O God, and renew your spirit within me. And what he's saying is he's saying, I want to be made new. I want to be made in the reflection of who God is. And it's a beautiful passage, one that countless pieces of art and song have reflected. And what our words should do is reflect that new heart within us. And it's not a just saying it's all good and everybody's fine. It's wanting to look at people through God's eyes. I remember back in the day, I knew a children's ministry person. And she was the opposite of who I had been at that time. Because she loved all the kids. And no matter who they were, no matter what they had done, she would always talk about them as a good kid. And it wasn't that she was denying that they had done bad things. It wasn't that she was denying that they were immature and hungry and cranky and doing all these other stuff. But she knew, because Jesus loved them, that she could love them too. She could care about them. And it was this beautiful piece. And let me give you this way of thinking about it. Because there's a bit of Christian wisdom that I think is so useful. That when you're trying to say something, you should ask yourself 3 questions. Is it true? Is it necessary? Is it loving? Because oftentimes what we will do is we will lapse into something that's true, but not loving or not necessary. Don't raise your hand for this one. But how many of you have been in a fight with somebody you're closest? Maybe you're a person you're married to, maybe your kids, maybe your parents. And you say something that is 100% true because you know it's going to hurt the most. I saw the hand. You don't need to put the hands up. It's okay. But it's true what we do. And friends, that is an unchristian way to handle it. Think about how Jesus does this. When Jesus is talking to people, he's always speaking out of that truth, love, and necessary lens. And you never see Jesus cranky or flying off the handle. Some of you know immediately go to, well, he cleansed the temple. He did cleanse the temple, but that was not him flying off the handle. If you want, we'll take 10 minutes and walk through that sometime. But whenever Jesus speaks to somebody, he does it through those 3 lenses. And he speaks well of them, but calls them to new life. And that's the way that we're called to be. James has this beautiful analogy where he says, look, your tongue is like the rudder on a ship. And we've all been out in the lake in Wisconsin. And think about it. You got a good-sized fishing boat, good-sized pontoon boat. And how much power do you need to direct that? I remember growing up being out in the boat with just the outboard motor, and you could swing it this much. Less effort than it took to pick up a can of Coke. And you could swing that boat around without any effort. What we speak determines our outlook. We can speak life and love, or we can speak death and curse. And when we speak those things, whichever way they go, they're on our own soul, our own hopes, our own dreams, and our own relationship to God. And so my hope and my prayer for all of you this morning is that we speak as a reflection of how Jesus speaks to us, out of his love, out of his joy, and most of all, out of his relationship with his Father. Amen.